You can now find me on RoadStr, the app connecting people through cars.
Hello everybody. There are lots of reasons why I'm very happy to be driving today's car, but I don't think I've ever been quite so excited about some seatbelts. Get onto today's car, let's talk about those seatbelts, shall we? Because they are amazing. The Americans have a very unusual relationship with safety. In many ways, I don't think they get anywhere near the credit they deserve for being quite pioneering. Though ultimately the only real purpose of any safety equipment should be to try and stop people dying needlessly, there are many Americans I've met who view any sort of government safety initiative as a way of encroaching on their personal freedoms and liberty, something Americans rightly take quite seriously. Even the humble seatbelt, that most basic of safety items, is still a bit of a sticking point, because the last time I visited the States, there were so many adverts and road signs telling you to remember to click it or tick it. Evidently, people still don't want to put a belt on. In the 1980s, the Americans decided, right, how do we get people to put seatbelts on whether they like it or not? So they came up with this genius idea, the automatic seatbelt, a two-part contraption. Down here, you have a regular lap belt, and then here, a second belt that is essentially the diagonal one here that sits here when parked, and then when you close the door, moves around and puts itself into place. This was a terrible idea for several reasons. First off, it moves pretty much when it wants to, not when you expect it to. To give you an example, as I'm trying to film today with my microphone on, I usually attach it to the belt. But if I then open the door, the microphone would be yanked out of my pocket and the cable probably broken. More of an issue, though, was the fact that for those people who still couldn't be bothered to put on the frankly rather awkward lap belt, if you then did have an accident, what you now have is one belt essentially across your neck. And that, surprisingly, isn't going to work well. Even more hilariously, the powers that be over in the States thought that this might actually be a reasonable substitute for airbags. Dear oh dear. Anyway, on to the car at hand. This is a 1989 Mazda RX-7 GTU, and the reason it has the American seatbelts is because it's actually an American import. That's why I'm on the wrong side of it. The funny thing about the RX-7 is that it's a car that came in 3 generations, and it's the third that most people remember. It's the one I certainly think of if anyone mentions RX-7. However, that was actually by far the worst selling of them all. The first generation car sold more than 450,000. The second generation sold over 250,000, and the third shifted just over 60,000. In fact, here in the UK, for the years where it was officially imported by Mazda, they shifted only around 200. Ironically, in the late 90s, when import rules changed and things were relaxed a bit, the grey market scene exploded. So far more cars made their way here that way than ever did officially. This, I have to confess, has also been one of the most difficult cars to research for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I really know next to nothing about them. I know a bit about the third generation cars, but very little about these. I'm not sure I've actually ever seen one in the wild here, though I'm told they did sell them. The only time I have spotted them would be at a car show, where it's taken me a minute to work out what they actually are, because at a quick glance they bear more than a passing resemblance to a Porsche 944, and that is no accident. The first generation RX-7 was introduced in 1975, and this is significant because that was a time of great change in American perception towards foreign cars. You see, to some extent, even now I suppose, the American car market is a bit of a protectionist one, because what Americans seem to want is American cars made by American people in American factories by American companies for American people and American needs. That often means that many of the cars they build don't work so well in other parts of the globe, and conversely, the cars built elsewhere don't always do so well in America. The reason I'm discussing America quite so much is really very simple. The first generation RX-7 sold better there than anywhere else in the world. Today, that may seem obvious. America is the biggest market for many manufacturers. However, that wasn't always the case. Particularly for the Japanese manufacturers, up until the 1970s, gaining widespread acceptance in the States wasn't a very easy thing to do. Not just because Americans like their own cars, but also because sentiment towards the Japanese was still a little bit frosty. However, give a country a good fuel crisis and they'll suddenly realise that maybe huge, great big 7-litre Fords aren't always the answer. Not that fuel economy is a particular strong point of this car. It does around about 20 to the gallon. However, by American standards, that's probably very good. The first generation RX-7 was a more stripped out, focused and fairly basic sports car. Because the first generation car had sold quite so well there, Mazda decided to tailor the second generation RX-7 more to American tastes. It didn't grow significantly, simply because if it did, in Japan, it would then cost an awful lot more to own. This happened with the third generation car, and is maybe one reason that didn't do quite so well. What they did do though was give it a lot more luxury features. This is a GTU, which is the base model from the year it was produced, 1989. It's got a leather looking dash, it's got fairly nice door cards. You've got this cloth material here. These are not the original seats, they would have been covered in this stuff too. It has windy windows, but it also has an electric sunroof and air conditioning as standard. That may be because this was a Californian car. It's actually been here for nearly 30 years now, being owned when it was in the States by a lady doctor who liked it so much she brought it over here with her. It has remained in the country ever since. However, at some point in time did wind up going into storage. This is the reason that this car isn't in cosmetically brilliant condition. It was bought 5 years ago by its current owner, Adam, and his father. They have, over time, been trying to restore it to original condition. They thought about modifying it, which many people do. However, they decided that there are so few of these cars out there that to try and modify one of the remaining examples would be sacrilege. And I have to say, I really admire what it is they're trying to do. There are so many different versions of these cars, trying to tell them apart is rather difficult. You may have noticed some turbo decals on this car. The reason for that is that the wings were replaced due to rot and they came from a turbo. This is actually a naturally aspirated car and made 160 horsepower when new. It has since had an aftermarket air filter fitted, so I'm sure now it makes 200 or 300 horsepower. Cosmetically, they still have some way to go, but mechanically, this car's quite good. It's an odd experience driving this car, not just because I'm on the wrong side of it, though that actually is the least of my concerns. It's very small, easy to place, so that's not a problem. However, that engine wants to go all the way to 8,000, but because of its rotary nature, it sounds like it's doing a lot more than that. In fact, to take it past 5 requires a very certain dedication, because you feel like you're just being mechanically completely unsympathetic. Listen, the gear shift is a problem. If you haven't noticed, getting it into third, not the easiest. Right, that's $4,000. That's 5. It sounds like I want to change up now. It's 5.5. That's 6, and I need to slow down. It's not particularly quick. Let's downshift though, that's fun. That's 6, 7. That's the 8, or near enough anyway. What a car! It really isn't quick, but that's okay because it means you can enjoy it. Barring third, the gearbox actually is also really quite nice, and I'm sure It's just a case of adjustment to get that working. The reason researching this has been quite so difficult is because A, we didn't really know anything about them, having not really seen many here, and certainly by the time I was growing up and paying attention to cars, I think these were all gone. Another victim, like the Sylvias and many other Japanese stuff, of the drift scene. The MX-5 isn't really any different, and this car's owner previously had one of those. He even had an RX-8 as his first ever car. Rotaries apparently are a family affliction. Oddly, he's not the first person I've met that had an RX-8 as their first car. If you had an RX-8 as your first car, I'd love to know a little bit more about it. How did you get on? Did anything hilarious happen? Was it a good idea? Did you regret everything? Please do tell all in the comments.
The other reason this car was difficult to research is because there is information online, but it's very confusing. Where do you even start? Though this is the second generation RX-7, it continued the series designation of the first, so the initial cars to be sold were actually dubbed Series 4. This one is a Series 5. There's also a Japanese-only Infini version. They have their own series designation unrelated to the main one. Next to no information was available about UK market cars, how many were sold, or what they had. Even worse, there was in the USA a limited edition of the car called a GTU-S. That was essentially the Club Sport version of the RX-7, with only 100 being made, making it the rarest of all RX-7s. Look online and you'll find many threads and posts about that car, but the vastly more common GTU that we're driving today has little about it, explaining what it lacked versus the other models, making a proper description of the car rather tricky. The car was certainly clever though. The small 1.3 litre twin-rotor engine got around tax issues in many territories. Even in America, they made good power. Remember, a 1993 Mustang made about the same as a 1990 RX-7 Turbo, but had a 4.9 litre V8 and a much heavier platform. The suspension here has a sort of passive rear steer in it, with anti-dive and anti-squat at the front. Despite being heavier than its predecessor, it's still some way lighter than a contemporary Porsche. These weigh around the 1200 kilo mark, and a 944 closer to 1400. Their rarity also makes them very difficult to value, particularly in Britain, although they command considerably less than their fast and famous successor.
This car is a 2+0. You could actually get them with seats behind you, but to be honest, I'm not that tall, 5'10", and this is already a fairly tight cabin. I've had to put the seat in a more Italian driving position, so I've lent it back a little bit and moved it forward to feel comfortable, but comfortable I am. These seats are pretty decent, little bit narrow for my liking, but they do the job. I've got no big issue with them. The steering wheel feels a little bit larger than it really needs to be, and I do quite enjoy the controls. The lights and wipers and everything are rather hilarious. They're dials either side of the dash, but the indicators are actually a little sort of, well, toilet handle, I want to call them. I've seen that on a few different cars before, and it's unusual to be in a Japanese car and not have the indicators on the right side. This is where they actually should be. On a left-hand drive car, they should be on the left. The only other modification that has been made to this car is a set of lowering springs. The reason for their fitment is very simple. Trying to get the originals is nearly impossible, and this is a pretty common theme with this car. To give you one example, when some of the welding work was done, unfortunately not enough attention was paid to where the seatbelts were, and one of them got melted. To replace it cost £300 and necessitated sourcing a part from America. If anything, I would have thought that owning a US one of these probably makes it one of the easier examples to maintain. The first year these were on sale in the States, they sold 86,000 of them. Total production figure, I think, was around the 270,000 mark. So pretty good run, really. Beyond the funky seatbelts, I can't actually even spot too many ways this car was ruined by the Americans. The only other oddity I've noticed is that to start it, you do have to have your foot on the clutch, and that may be an American thing. I said earlier that this car bears more than a passing resemblance to the 944, and I think that's no coincidence. Mazda apparently drew great inspiration from the Porsche 928, which was a big seller in America at the time, though for me this is clearly more 944 styling. Having driven a number of 944s and currently owning a 968, how do the two compare? Well, actually, very favourably. This, I would say, actually feels just as upmarket, really, as even the 968. Yeah, the dials and things are a little bit more out of date. Some of them feel closer to, say, the first 944, but it's a decent place to spend time. I like the fact it's also got a sunroof. The size of it is very, very similar indeed. You've got acres of storage in the back, more so than in the Porsche, and that was despite this car being fitted with a fully independent rear suspension, something the first generation didn't get. The gearbox here, when it's behaving, I think could be just as good, if not maybe better, than in the Porsche, although, unsurprisingly, the Porsche does seem to have a little bit more torque, particularly the 968 with its 3-litre. That makes around 240 horsepower versus the 160 of this. A fairer comparison would have been the turbo. Those made around 200 horses. It was only in the later FD where they got the twin turbo sequential setup. These, I think, just had a very basic single turbo arrangement. I am sure many of you will probably have passed judgment on this car the moment you saw the state that it was in. But the fact is, this is currently a daily driver for its owner, because his other car, a Mark III Golf, is currently awaiting some work of its own. I've actually been generally quite impressed with the overall grip levels. The refinement too is pretty decent. When you aren't absolutely caning it, the thing is pretty quiet. Even when driving past, this is actually one of the few times I would say you could definitely put a louder exhaust on this car. One difference between this and the 944 is the fact that they do have an enormous B-pillar. So the Porsche has a little bit less bodywork, a little bit more glass. That means for your sort of rear three-quarter over there, it's a little bit less well-sighted. And driving this car is a joy. Heel and toe seems a little trickier than it should. I think that's because I'm on the left side of the car, and I know the pedals are still in more or less the same place as they should be, but heel and toe in left-hand drive cars always just comes a little bit less naturally to me. The car certainly seems keen enough to do it though, so I don't think I can blame it for my shortcomings. This is really quite special. You can still carry reasonable speed though. The steering is pretty nice. Feels maybe a little slower steering-wise than the Porsche. Get the brakes a bit of a test in a moment as well. And now we've got a bit of straight. Let's pile them on. Oh yeah, okay, so overall braking power, not that good. That's the tyres limiting things. They are old and a budget, I believe. So, gonna bear that in mind. And there's a British man having a picnic there by his car. It doesn't really seem to have the torque to overload the rear wheels, which is probably a good thing. I don't know how quickly it's going to break away, and I don't really want to find out. It's got a real sense of sort of can-do attitude about it, this car. I love it. I have to confess, when I first saw it, I thought it was going to just be very unpleasant. It's even quite refined in terms of the ride. It's actually softer damped than you might expect, particularly when you realise it's got those lowering springs on it. If anything, I'd say if you wanted, you could easily firm this up quite a bit, make it a bit broader tracked, give it stickier tyres, and I think it would cope quite well. There are a couple of rattles in here, but I think they're all coming from the dash area and some of the stuff that's in the back, including the massive IKEA thing. I don't think it's a bear. I actually did have some thoughts a little while ago about maybe chopping the 968 in for an RX-7 until I saw what had happened to the prices of those. But I never considered an FC. I just didn't even give one a moment's thought. Maybe I should have done. I'm really attached to the 968. I don't think that's going anywhere anytime soon. But if I hadn't got that car, as an alternative, funky, summer daily driver, this thing's quite a riot. Motorways may become a little bit tedious with that kind of fuel consumption and the RPM that it'll want to maintain, but I still know very, very little about the FC. So, if you've made it this far in the review, first off, thank you very much. You are a very, very kind and lovely person. Secondly, if you do happen to know more about these than I do, which is not difficult, please hop into the comment section and feel free to share that knowledge with us all, and then the next time I visit one of these, I'll try and share as much of that as I can. For now though, I want to say a great big thank you to you for watching, to Adam for bringing his car out. Please hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye bye!